many groups of people who felt culturally, socially, and economically alienated, left behind, abandoned, choose your words. And he had no account of that. And I think that in another earlier bit of the piece, he talked about the administration from 2010 to 2015. He said austerity was a necessity. We had to focus on that. Well, maybe, but he didn't have to abandon the agenda that he had carefully created it from 2008 to 2010, which was all about trying to rebalance the country, create a world in which those at the bottom or at the sidelines of our society had a stake in it. And that was abandoned sort of overnight. And he shouldn't be surprised, really. He helped create, he wasn't the instigator, but he helped create the conditions for the Brexit vote. And I think that's where...
Yeah, I was going to say, if he didn't know the extent of the Leave support, does that make him complacent, arrogant?
I think complacent. But I think that's true across the West. We've been governed by a small liberal elite, extreme economic liberalism, extreme social liberalism. They only constitute 10 to 12% of the country, and they've done policy and politics that's in their interests, and they have no idea of interests outside of their framework. So it's blindsided Cameron, it blindsided people in America with Trump, and of course in Europe. So it's part of a wider phenomenon that the policy we've had since Mrs. Thatcher is no longer delivering for as I said, the sideline, the abandoned, and it also came with an awful smug cosmopolitan superiority. And I think people have had more than enough of that.
Right, let's bring in Jonathan Isaby there. So Phillip Blond talks about Cameron being blindsided. Should he have seen it coming?
I think he should have seen it coming, frankly. I mean, UKIP had come second in the 2009 European elections, and then they won the 2014 European elections, and there was clearly an increasing sense of dissatisfaction with everything that was coming from the European Union and the lack of democracy therein, and the fact that there had never been British consent for the ever closer union that the EU was promoting. So he was absolutely right to hold that referendum. He should have been well aware that the country was deeply sceptical about the direction of the European Union. And today he's apologised, I think, for the divisions that the Brexit referendum has caused. What he hasn't apologised for is several other things, one of which is the fact that he didn't allow the civil service in the run-up to the referendum to prepare for the eventuality that the British people might vote Leave in the referendum. There was this, frankly, arrogance from David Cameron and George Osborne at the time that Leave would not win, that Remain would win the day, and that all would carry on regardless once the referendum was over. Of course, that didn't happen, and the fact that he didn't allow the civil service to prepare for the possibility of a Leave vote created a huge vacuum in the aftermath of the 2016 referendum, which I think a lot of people, whichever side you're on, think was very irresponsible.
And I'll stay with you now. Talking of these attacks on Michael Gove, it's emerged that he wanted to demote him from Education Secretary, and clearly he was moved. And now it seems that their friendship has been done irreparable damage. He talks about he's barely talked to him in the past few years. Clearly must have hurt both David Cameron, and as we've seen this morning, we saw Michael Gove coming out of his house, said hardly anything.
Look, I mean, clearly the referendum dented a lot of political relationships and indeed personal relationships, whether they be people sitting around the cabinet table or people in the rest of the country. I dare say David Cameron has been happy to go into the gory details as part of his tour to sell the book that he's going to be flogging as of next week. And obviously he's been very critical of Michael Gove and Boris Johnson and the Leave campaign. I'll be interested to see the book, what he says about the Remain campaign, whether he expresses any regret about the way in which the Remain campaign used, frankly, taxpayers' money to promote this idea that if we voted to leave the European Union, there'd be an immediate recession and there'd be mass unemployment, neither of which happened, which again was part of that irresponsible Project Fear campaign promoted by David Cameron and his friends.
The trouble, Phillip Blond, isn't it, that the trouble with prime ministers is that their legacy more often than not ends in failure, and he has admitted to failures, and this will what he will be remembered for.
Well, I think it was Enoch Powell who said all political careers end in failure. So it's about sort of your gradations of failure, and I do think that he will be remembered for two things. I think he'll be remembered for abandoning the transformative agenda for conservatism and for losing the Brexit vote. And I think the two are linked. And I think that creates, unfortunately for him and for his position, you know, quite a poor legacy. And it's a shame. He's a deeply talented man. I think he's a decent man. And I think that his view was circumscribed by his class, by his position, and by his unawareness of what was coming and what was going on in the country. And I mean, I warned this, you know, I published Red Tory back in 2010, and I said, you know, that if we carry on as we have been doing, you know, there's going to be an almighty eruption. And so it's proved. And I think the disappointment for those on the more radical wing who worked with him is how quickly he abandoned a pro-poor conservatism, for want of a better word, and went for just a standard Thatcherite austerity, and then was surprised by Brexit. And I agree with Jonathan. They ran a very poor Brexit campaign, but they also ran a very poor Scottish referendum campaign, focusing on economic scare stories, focusing on economics rather than meaning, rather than culture. And Leave, actually, I think, ran a very good campaign that was about nationhood, solidarity, and culture. And, you know, it was pretty obvious that this was the wrong approach, but no, they carried on.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Time's beaten us, gentlemen. Many thanks indeed for your time. One thing is sure, we're going to get more revelations tomorrow, and we've got the memoirs to come, so plenty more time for discussion. But both Jonathan Isaby and Phillip Blond, thank you for your time today.